Hi, everybody. I am Nijay Gupta. I'm here with my friend Richard Middleton, who I've known for many years now. And I'm excited to talk today about his new book with Baker Academic Press called Abraham's Silence. Richard asked me to read the book a while back, and I read it with great delight. I learned a lot from it, and since then, I've been talking it up big time with my students, putting that on their Christmas list, make sure that they can process this wonderful, wonderful book. So we're going to spend a good amount of time today talking about that. But we thought it would be fun just to introduce each other to everybody that's watching and listening today. So Richard Middleton, I know, teaches at Northeastern Seminary of Roberts Wesleyan College in Rochester, New York. It's actually in Chilai, if you know the area. And the reason I know this is because I was a colleague of Richard's for, unfortunately, just a short period of time. I would have liked to have been his colleague for many, many, many decades, but for a short period of time. But we got a chance to be colleagues at Northeastern. He teaches, I would say, Old Testament theology, but he's also really, really, really good at whole Bible biblical theology, obviously eschatology, worldview studies, all kinds of other stuff. He's kind of a Renaissance man in many ways because of his multiple interests. Some of us just do really narrow stuff, and Richard does really broad stuff. I will say also, because probably no one has said this yet about Richard Middleton, he is a wicked good badminton player. He wiped the court with me at least once, maybe more than once. I can't remember how many times we played. But we have really enjoyed talking about Canada, as he is Jamaicadian, as he says. We've enjoyed talking about biblical scholarship, and I'm just so delighted to be able to talk about his new book today.
Nijay, thank you so much. It's fantastic seeing you again after all this
Yeah.
time. And I've tracked your career as you moved on from Northeastern, and now we're at Northern. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Another directional
Yeah.
seminary. Um, well, I want to talk today about your book, Abraham's Silence. Richard, this is a really interesting book. It's different than other books because it's not just on one topic. If you had to describe it sort of in one or two or three words, in some ways it's kind of hard because it covers a range
Yeah.
of topics. I would say it's about the divine human relationship, broadly speaking, but there's a lot more to it. First of all, I don't have the book in front of me because you're so lucky to have a physical copy, but can you say the whole title of the book? Because I love the subtitle, but I can't say it off the top of my
Yeah.
head.
So
And then tell us a little bit about how this book came to be.
okay, so I got to read the subtitle because it was not my subtitle. It came from the publisher. So it's called Abraham's Silence, subtitled "The Binding of Isaac, the Suffering of Job, and How to Talk Back to God." I
I
think
actually really like the subtitle, by
I
the
had a
way.
more academic sounding subtitle. I said no,
I
let's
know.
make it more conversational. Yeah.
I really like the title because I think in the end it does that last part gets into what the book's about. So give us your kind of elevator pitch synopsis of, someone says to you, "What are you working on?"
So
And you say
it was
what?
hard. It was hard to do this when I was working on it, even to pitch it to Baker Academic, because it has multiple components. So most fundamentally, you said it's about the divine human relationship. I
Mhm.
think one way to put that is to say it's about a theology of prayer.
Yes.
It's about how we engage God in our personal lives, verbally, through struggling with God in prayer. But the way I address that is by looking at, first of all, prayer throughout the Old Testament and the vigorous nature of prayer, and then come to the topic of Abraham's silence. Why is Abraham not praying for his son Isaac?
Yeah, and we can go chapter by chapter, but I think what you do in the book is really helpful. Is you kind of juxtapose in some ways the famous Abraham story of the binding of Isaac and Abraham's response, and then kind of what's going on in Job. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think is behind the book, and I'm kind of trying to read your mind, but I know you well enough to know maybe I'm reading your mind well, is sometimes an apprehension on the part of Christians, perhaps also Jews, to um, to talk back to God. There's this sense of we shouldn't ever question God. We shouldn't pose God questions. We shouldn't challenge God. We shouldn't be angry with God. we shouldn't treat God like a regular relationship.
Hmm.
And I think about this because I'm Indian, as you could probably tell, and in an Indian family, um, uh, you have to treat your parents with the utmost respect, and in that context, you don't yell at your parents, you don't talk back to your parents, you don't question their decisions, you just do what they tell you to do. And of course, they're rebellious children in all cultures, but the culture of, I'm guessing, even a Mediterranean culture is one of not talking back to an authority. So walk us through. So let's start with Abraham. Let's start with Abraham. Walk us through what the traditional interpretations are of Abraham's piety. That I really liked how you broke down. Okay, the normal approach
Right.
to studying this text. Maybe not everybody, but the norm is uh, valorizing or making pious Abraham's silence. Talk about that, and then talk about how you approach that, because you take a different take on that.
Right. So, growing up in the church, I learned that Abraham, in his response to God, that he was totally obedient, that this is a model for us. And the way I learned it was the model is that you should never put any human value over a commitment to God. So, Abraham is asked to give up his child of promise that God had promised to him. But this is not as important to him as his relationship to God. So, he must do what God says. As an 18-year-old, I taught Sunday school to 14-year-olds, and I remember teaching this very thing. And I mentioned it in the book, sitting on a bench on a hot Sunday morning outside of my church with a bunch of 14-year-olds talking about why we should not put anything before our commitment to God.
Hmm.
A subsidiary point that is not so explicit, but I've seen it in the church over the years, is that if Abraham would obey God in this rigidly difficult circumstance, he must sacrifice his own son. Who are we to ever complain about anything that befalls us? It is simply God's will. We should accept it and be submissive. That's more a secondary interpretation I've heard. And there are other interpretations in the Jewish tradition that I do get to in the book, but that's what I learned. And when I went through a time in my life when I found that God was not living up to my expectations. So the promises of God that I'd learned from Scripture were very high value to me, and my life was falling apart, and God was not coming through. I only rediscovered my faith and renewed my faith when I started reading and praying the lament psalms.
Hmm.
And looking back on that time of darkness I was in, I realized I'd simply stopped praying. I've been utterly silent for maybe 4, 5, 6 months. And looking back, my interpretation is, well, why would I keep praying to a God who I didn't trust anymore to come through for me?
Right.
So I just silenced the relationship. But once you start to bring the pain to God, it restarts the relationship. And as you pointed out in your introduction, if you're in a serious relationship with another person, could be in a marriage or a deep friendship, and something's going wrong between you, silence is the worst possible thing. It causes the fracturing of the relationship. But if you confront the other person, and confrontation is not a bad thing, because you're saying, I trust you enough to tell you what's going on and to ask for you to deal with this with me.
Right.
So that's what's going on, I think, in the lament psalms, and that's why I start with a chapter on the lament psalms.
All right, we're going to go a little academic here, Richard, just to kick it up a notch for our listeners and
Sure.
viewers. So, uh, you talk about how there is a long, uh, respected history of viewing Abraham's silence as pious. Can you tell us? I'm thinking off the top of my head, just having read the manuscript 6 8 months ago. Can you I think John Levinson may be one of them. Is that right?
Yes,
A
yes.
few others. Can you just to kind of set up the alternative? Why have scholars? What have scholars seen in the text, or why have they argued that Abraham's silence is pious?
Well, that's a motivation question, and that's hard to get at because I don't
What
want to make it.
arguments are they using? Sorry, what arguments are they using?
So that's I don't know that they're actually using any arguments. What I think is going on is the tradition has been overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so you read through the tradition. Often you read a biblical text and you've never thought of any alternative way to read it. It's obvious what it means. But when you think this is not necessarily the meaning, let's look at it differently. Initially you're saying, nah, it couldn't be so. Until you get habituated to looking at it differently. So I think that's what's going on. Now, John Levinson from the Jewish tradition and Walter Moberly from the Christian
It's
tradition,
Walter, that's
they
right.
give a complex Christian interpretation and Jewish interpretation of the text that goes beyond this idea that Abraham should just submit to God because it's God's will. And they have a complex reading that this text really is a paradigm for what would happen in the Jerusalem temple when you offered sacrifices. Your attitude in offering a sacrifice should be that you're doing it purely for God. So you're being submissive to God. And they both argue, and it's really a Jewish argument, but Moberly, who's a Christian theologian, picks it up, that when the temple was destroyed and there were no more sacrifices, that what Judaism did was said the same attitude Abraham had should be the attitude when you pray. And prayer
Right.
replaces sacrifices. So they view this text more as a paradigm for how the tradition understands genuine piety. And they don't really read it for what's going on in the narrative itself, at least the way I have perceived it. And they challenge anyone, both Moberly and Levinson, that if you're going to go against the traditional reading, you're clearly reading from outside scriptural authority, from a modern perspective of doubt, and not from within the tradition. And
Right.
my whole point is there are many ways to read from within the Orthodox tradition. One is to read from a lens that came on the text later. That's what I think they did. Another is to read from a lens that was within biblical theology itself, which is what I try to do.
So that's a good transition to asking, honestly, and I don't know your field, but you're the first person in my reading that has argued that Abraham's silence was not good.
Mhm.
In a sense, was not what God wanted. That it would have been better had he spoken up. Um, Now, I remember reading this, thinking, is there evidence for this? So and then you offer evidence for. Can you talk through how you argue this case, even some basic lines from Genesis or from the Pentateuch, how you make this case that that Abraham's silence is not what God wanted?
Right. So I guess I make it in two ways. First, I put Abraham in the context of the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament too. I deal with Jesus' teaching on prayer. And I show that God wants vigorous dialogue partners. And you
Vigorous
see that
dialogue, yeah.
from the lament Psalms. One third of the Psalms are laments, which challenge God. You see that from the model of Moses interceding on behalf of Israel at the golden calf, that God would change his mind, and God does. And he intercedes again at Kadesh Barnea when the people don't want to enter the land. God's going to destroy them. He says, do what you did before. And God says, sure, I'll forgive them. And the various prophets intercede. And finally, for me, the clincher is Job, because there are all these intertextual connections between Job and Abraham, including the fact that both are said to be God-fearers. Both use the term dust and ashes, a phrase used nowhere else in the Bible except by Job and Abraham, and many other connections. But Job is this protester. He challenges God, and he is vindicated by God at the end for his challenge. So this leads me to say something is going wrong with Abraham's silence. Why does it stand out like a sore thumb? But I also go within the text of Genesis. And so one of the arguments has been that Abraham needs to give up his son because he values Isaac so much and he must show his commitment to God. I actually show that he doesn't value Isaac at all. It's Ishmael he values. For example, when he passes off Sarah as his sister to the Philistine king of Gerar, Sarah is probably pregnant with Isaac at the time. God has just said that the birth is going to come soon. Yet he passes her off again as if he doesn't care that he has this son because it's really Ishmael he wants. So I don't see that it's a test of Abraham's commitment to his son versus God. In fact, when you read the Abraham story, you see Abraham getting bolder and bolder with God, questioning God, the promises God makes in chapter 15, and God addresses his questions. God says to Abraham in chapter 18, shall I withhold from my servant Abraham what I'm going to do about Sodom? And Abraham challenges God, and God says, anything you want, I'll do it. So Abraham is learning to challenge God, but he doesn't quite learn enough. So God gives him this final test. I'm going to tell him that he's got to kill his own son. Now, if anything will cause him to challenge me back and say, you can't do this, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? This would be the case, but it doesn't actually happen. So by reading Abraham within the context of the whole Bible on prayer, and within the context of the Genesis story of Abraham, it allows me to challenge what the traditional reading is, because it doesn't actually make sense exegetically.
Yeah, so along those lines, have you found other scholars that have before you that have had already kind of brought up questions about this interpretation, the pious silence interpretation?
So I mined the history of ancient interpretation, and I found maybe not even half a dozen Jews and Christians who were questioning Abraham's silence in pre-modern times.
Yeah,
I don't know the history well, so I had to depend on other sources I was reading that pointed towards this. But clearly, in the 20th century, there have been a lot of people objecting to Abraham's silence. The majority have been Jews. A lot of if you read a Jewish sermon, really a Devar Torah, what they call a word of Torah for their Sabbath services, you'll find a lot of Jews commenting on this text because it comes up a lot in the lectionary.
yeah,
They question it, but they question it in light of the rabbinic tradition and the Old Testament tradition of grappling with God. But they don't really give exegetical reasons for it. But
right.
it's very, very common. And this is the kind of stuff that Levinson was objecting to, that you question it
Oh,
without any exegetical basis. Christians have begun doing that too in the 20th century. But again, they tend to be very skeptical Christians who don't trust the authority of Scripture. This is why
right.
Mobley was questioning that. But there are a few things I've read of late where are along the lines of what I was doing, but they were not in great exegetical detail. One of them is Len Sweet. Len Sweet has a little
Oh,
book called something like Out of the Question and Into the Mystery. He's got two really nice chapters on the Akedah that move in the direction that I'm moving in, though he doesn't give really good exegetical grounding. But I found that very similar to the kinds of things I was interested in. And I found a few things like that along the way, but not an in-depth exegesis. So that's what I wanted to do to fill that gap.
let's transition talking about Job because your book works with this kind of comparison between Abraham and Job. Why Job? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I'm sure there's more to it than that. Why Job, and what did you see in Job that made for an important
Right.
comparison?
So I was teaching on Job as part of a component of a wisdom literature course that I was doing for undergraduates many years ago. And every time I come around, I do about 4 or 5 lectures on Job. So I've got to think through the book of Job and what's going on. And the majority interpretation when I started was that God is basically slapping Job in the face, saying, "Shut up, you've no right to question me." But I did find a few people who were going against that, and I found my own interpretation of that and tried it out in a paper at SBL. And I got really good response from even one biblical scholar who said, "You have saved God from being a divine bully for me. Now I can read the book of Job with hope." And he got me to come and give the Peter C. Craigie lecture at the University of Calgary on Job. And this started me thinking more about it. So God at the end of the book of Job says to Job's friends, "You, y'all, plural, haven't spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has."
Hmm.
And some people think that the right speech of Job is simply when he says, "I repent in dust and ashes." But actually, he says, "The friends haven't spoken of me." So this is referring to the poetic dialogues where the friends are dialoguing and saying stuff. And also, I think that it's really referring to the fact that in the first speech from the whirlwind, when God shows Job the constellations and the wild animals, he actually is correcting Job's theology. So there is a correction going on. But the exegetical question that I had that led me to my interpretation of Job was really this. If God shut Job up after the first speech, because Job said, "I put my hand over my mouth, I'm not going to say anything more." So he shut Job down. Why is there a second speech? Why do you need a
Right.
second speech to bully Job further into the dust and ashes? And the second speech shows Job two monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan, the main characteristic of which, and William Brown at Columbia has pointed this out most, the main characteristic is they got big mouths. One has his mouth open, the Jordan River is rushing against it like a hippopotamus, and he can't move him. He can outstand the torrent. And Job at one point could outlast a torrent of his friends' words, right?
Mhm.
The other thing is Leviathan breathes fire, and he says no one can put a hook in his tongue and tame him. And God seems proud of these monsters. The analogy would be God is saying, "Do you understand, Job? My critique of your theology didn't mean to say, be quiet. I like big mouthed beasts who challenge me. I'm not afraid of them." And that's what comforts Job at the end.
Yeah. Now this can yeah, I think you're right. This can really challenge people because the normal narrative is Job's kind of a whiner.
Yeah, yeah,
So let's go back to your language of vigorous prayer because I found that really helpful. I pray with my kids and we say these nice, sweet prayers. Thank
yeah,
you for this dinner. Thank you for this blessed day. And uh, you know, I think many people find it hard to go deep in
yeah.
prayer with God, not just to feel God's presence or learn from God, but to say things like, God, I'm mad at you. I would say most of the Christians I know don't pray in that way
Right.
because it seems um, impolite to God.
Yes.
So, what do you mean by vigorous prayer?
So in most prayer, you can be polite and you can address God, oh Lord, we love you. You've done so much for us, and
Yep, yep.
it's fine. But you think of how Psalm 22 begins. You start the prayer with, my God, why have you abandoned me? So if you, my analogy was this: so that when I was first working on Job and thinking about this, I was living in Canada at the time, and my pastor had his office there, and I would work at the church sometimes because I had no office myself, and I would do writing there. And if I was not in a situation of crisis, I'd go to his office door and I'd knock. You got a moment? Let's talk. Can I talk? And we chat. If I'm desperate, I just bang the door open. I got to talk, right? So that kind of vigorous prayer is a signal of your desperation, how much you need God.
Mm.
Without grappling with God, you can't move on. So for me, it's actually a form of trust. It's some very deep trust to be able to do that. But you need to be able to believe that God will accept that kind of prayer. So you have to almost change your theology. Or the way I put it in the book, sometimes you're not sure God can handle it, but there's no other alternative. To whom else shall we go? No one else has the words of eternal
That's
life.
right.
So
Yeah.
you challenge God and you learn that God accepts your prayer and that God grows in mercy in your eyes and the relationship can blossom. So for me, I'm not saying you always need to pray these kinds of vigorous prayers, but when you need to, you need to be prepared that this is possible and God will accept them.
I used to teach a course on prayer when I was at Portland Seminary. And sometimes I'd show my students a clip from the movie The Apostle. Do you
I'm
remember
just
this
going to
movie?
quote that to you.
Yeah,
I was
with
going to
Robert
quote it to you.
Duvall.
Yeah,
And so, for those of you who
upstairs.
don't know, it's definitely a good movie to watch. But when I think of vigorous prayer and the stuff you've done, I think about this. Robert Duvall plays this kind of uh, um,
Pentecostal. Yeah.
backslidden or preacher who ends up kind of getting called by God to go kind of on the road, and he kind of his life goes through some ups and downs. And there's this beautiful scene where he's staying with his mother and he's in some kind of attic, I think, and it's late at night and he just starts praying out loud and he's yelling at God and he's saying, God, you called me to be your apostle and I'm doing this thing, but things aren't going well. And he's just kind of yelling at God. And it's funny, the neighbors call the house to complain it's too loud. And the mother just takes the phone off the hook, the ringer, and goes back to sleep. I just really love that
No,
image.
one more scene there. My memory is that she's outdoors and the neighbors are there asking what's going on. And she says, don't worry, my son's just having a little chat with Jesus.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
love
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a different portrayal of our relationship with God than kind of the quiet, solemn experience. But I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit with you since you
Sure.
published a book on this. Um, there's a line that you cross, or that you can cross to impropriety with God. So let me give you an example, and I want your thoughts on this. So in the beginning of the Gospels, um, you have, let's say, the Gospel of Luke. You have an angel appearing to uh, Zacharias and saying, hey, this is going to happen, and he expresses disbelief, and he receives the curse of silence, aphasia. But then Mary is receives an angel, and she says, how can this be? And in a sense, she's talking back to God in a general way, and she's blessed.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's a line you can cross, right? I do work in the area of faith and doubt. I've been studying this for a while. My friend AJ Swoboda and I have a podcast on this, And in dialogue with various scholars, we've talked about the word doubt, and that comes into play with prayer, right? And what I've come to conclude is there's a line you cross from normal doubt, hesitation, uncertainty, my God, why have you forsaken me, into disbelief or rejection of God. Process that for me. If we talk about talking back to God, and I know that's not the language you
Yeah, yeah,
use,
yeah, yeah.
but if we talk about vigorous prayer, talking back to God, lamenting, what's the difference between lament? Let's put it this way, because this is in your wheelhouse. What's the difference between lament and sinful disrespect towards God?
Right, right.
Because I think that's hard for
Yes,
people.
yes. So lament prayer has a number of components, and Old Testament scholars would analyze the components of lament. The two primary components are complaint and petition. Complaint is you tell God what the problem is. And the problem can be my own sin. In sin my mother conceived me, Psalm 51. It could be enemies are attacking me and slandering me. Many psalms say that, or it could be you're the problem, God. Why have you forsaken me?
Yeah,
Or in
yeah.
Psalm 48, Lord, wake up. You're asleep at the switch. Come on, get moving. So you describe the problem, but then you also ask for a remedy. You supplication or petition becomes an important part. So some psalms, like 88, I mentioned in the book, have very little petition. They have a mention that every morning I cry to you, but you're not listening to me. But some psalms are dominated by petition, where you ask God for stuff. Here's my understanding. I call lament petition with an edge, or supplication with an edge.
Yeah.
But it's really on the continuum of asking God for what God has already promised.
Promised.
So you're holding God to the promises. That's what petition is. I mean, the Lord's Prayer is petition. May your kingdom come. And God, I mentioned God said, are you telling me my kingdom is not coming? Who are you to tell me that? And may your name be sanctified. What's my name is already sanctified. No, you're calling on what you know is supposed to be true, but it's not fully realized in your life. So you're asking it to be true. And it can be God-oriented petitions, like may your kingdom come. It could be very us-oriented, like give us this day our daily bread. It could even be I-oriented, what I need. So that's not, I think, crossing the line. That's calling on God based on the theology of what we've already been taught God is supposed to be like, what is God supposed to do, and just saying, actualize the realities that you have already promised in my life. And you can do that in an abrasive way if you're really upset, or you can do that in a more gentle way. But it's a continuum of petition. That's how I look at it.
Sure. Okay. Well, I know you're an Old Testament theologian, but my area is New Testament. Can you talk about Jesus? Where does Jesus fit into, as a model of
Yeah,
prayer,
yeah,
in a Christian construct of understanding Jesus as, vicar, right? He's the
yeah,
one
yeah.
that is the agent of our supplication. Where does Jesus fit into all this?
So let me think about this. The Lord's Prayer is purely petition.
Yeah.
Even there's God-oriented petitions. You're asking God for something. The two parables on prayer that Jesus teaches about being steadfast in petition are the parable of the unjust judge, or the importunate widow, if you will, who badgers the judge until she gets justice, and the parable of the friend at midnight, who wakes up his friend to get some food to feed a visitor, and which is intercessory prayer, both of which are to teach us that steadfastness in prayer is what God wants. And those parables, though it's not stated, they also teach you that boldness in prayer is what God wants. To
Yeah.
confront God, this is what we need. So give it to us. Give us this day our daily bread, even for our neighbor, and so forth. Then you have the actual example of Jesus, where Thomas is not sure about Jesus. He's not condemned for that doubt. Jesus says, touch me, feel me. I'm not a ghost, I'm real. And Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Or in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus wants to plead with the Father to take this cup from him, but that submits that your will be done. But he still articulates what he wants. That this is going to be hard. I don't really want to do this, but I'll do what you say. And on the cross, he cries out, the Psalm 22, why have you abandoned me? Probably with the implication that the whole psalm ends with God answering the servant. And so he knows there's going to be an answer. And so the resurrection is the answer to the cry on the cross. I look at it that way. So Jesus both teaches and models vigorous prayer. It's not a problem at all for
Hmm.
Jesus.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because, if you've come from an upbringing or culture where um, prayer is just making nice and having manners
Hmm.
before God, then it's hard to turn to God when you're going through hard times. And you talk a little bit about your journey. You mentioned it already. I don't know if you'd be willing to talk about it now, but your book talks not only about the academic dimensions of these exegetical theological discussions, but you get into your life
Yeah.
and your own experiences. Would you be willing, Richard, to talk a little bit more
Sure.
about that and how your life experiences have played into some of the reflections you have about a relationship with God?
Yeah. So when I was about 30, 31, I went through a vocational crisis. I'd started a doctorate that crashed and burned. I have a journal in which 20 things went wrong in the first year. And I couldn't, for my mental health, I had to leave. But then I was directionless. I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. And that's when I actually ended up finding out about Rochester. I was living in Ithaca at the time. And I went to Rochester and took courses in Old Testament at Colgate Rochester Divinity School.
Mhm.
10 years later, that allowed me to have a job there. But my first course was a Psalms course where I had to do a project for the Psalms course. And based on my own sense of darkness where I was in, I decided that I would take Psalm 88 and I would construct a worship service of memorial for a young dean of students who had just died the previous semester in her 30s. And this memorial service was based on Psalm 88, the most dark psalm, if you will. One of our songwriters, Carol Doran, who's a very famous hymn writer, was teaching music at the seminary at the time. She put Psalm 88 in Mitchell Dahoud's Anchor Bible translation to a plain song. And it was sung as a call to worship by my Old Testament colleague, Warner Lemke, in a deep baritone, a cappella. And we did a refrain in that.
Mhm.
And that set up the service. And then we had different aspects of it. And I preached on Psalm 88 on why it's a psalm of hope. And you know what? I was preaching to myself, of course,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Just as much as everybody else.
yeah.
When that service was over, I found my faith was beginning to be renewed. And
Mhm.
that's when I came back to viewing that articulation of grief to God and suffering to God is the beginning of hope and renewal in a person's life. But shutting down is the worst thing that could happen to you. And what happened very in a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, was I was doing campus ministry after that, and I began to have people come to me with serious problems, and I was not prepared to have counseled them if I had not gone through this and learned that God was open to our suffering, and we was able to help these people go through some sort of a renewal of faith,
Mhm.
which I was not prepared for before. So I learned that it was not only helpful to me, it was also helpful for ministry to others.
Yeah.
And all of my life, academic and otherwise, since has had this overlay of God is willing to hear us in our pain. So it's no more Pollyannish kind of everything's going to be great. Kingdom of God is coming. Join the movement. It's going to be fantastic. Well, yeah, it is. But we're often in the valley as we live between the times. So it's been very helpful to me for living and for ministry.
Yeah. I want to. We're wrapping up, but I want to go back to your title, Abraham's Silence, and I want to just clarify something because I love the title because it kind of intrigues you and makes you want to read the book, but it can make it seem like on a superficial level, like silence is bad.
Right, right, right.
So just talk to me about, are there times where we need to be silent before God, and how do you see I guess when I read your book, I really wrestled with that question.
Yes,
Because I think you made the case. Your case is strong, but I wrestle that question. When do I need to hold my tongue? And this
yes.
happens in real relationships,
Yes, yeah, sure,
meaning
yes,
human to human relationships.
yes,
When do I hold my tongue and just listen? And when do I speak out? Um, what was Abraham to do? How would he have known to make that decision? So talk a little bit
yeah.
about is silence the problem, and how do we know when to be silent and when to talk?
I am not at all saying that you should always talk. I am not a person who talks that much, actually. I like silence. And a very good friend of mine who teaches Old Testament at Tyndale in Toronto, John Kessler, has written a book about silence and speech in the Old Testament, where silence is sometimes appropriate. And there comes a place, in the structure of the book of the 12, the minor prophets, where let all the earth be silent before the Lord, and the laments stop at a certain point. So it's very interesting that I'm not saying at all that silence is inappropriate. I don't know if I can give some principle about when you should be silent and when you should not. It's more a sense of being attuned to God and attuned to other people. So in a relationship, right? Well, when it comes to church, right? One of the things that my students often say is, when we're learning all this stuff with the Bible, I want to correct my pastor. And I've told them, there are many times you need to be silent.
Yeah, that's
You choose your
or
battles.
professors or
Choose your battles.
professors.
Yeah. I tell them, you can correct me anytime. I'm not
Oh,
going to worry about it. I'm fine with that. I would like some people to talk a bit more in class who are more silent. So, and in a relationship, of course, silence is often. Sometimes I have been in with people, I've just been silent and hung up with them for 20, 30 minutes. No talking. I don't need to talk. You just are there. So,
yeah.
yeah, I affirm that silence is very important in our lives. And my point was specifically that if you're in a situation where, the text of Genesis 22 does not tell us what Abraham was feeling. And Eric Auerbach, the Jewish scholar, has talked in his article Mimesis, his book Mimesis, on Genesis 22 that it's fraught with background, but there's little in the foreground. So we don't know what's going on. But as a Jewish scholar friend of mine, Shai Held, has put it, that doesn't mean Abraham wasn't thinking or feeling anything. It probably was
Right.
swirled with
Oh,
emotion within. So the question is, for me, when that's happening to you, what do you just hold it in? There comes times when you need to speak for your own psychological and spiritual health.
yeah, I like that.
Yeah, so it
Uh,
depends. It's contextual.
I'm
It's
gonna, I'm
context.
gonna ask you here, just as we wrap up, to engage in some speculation.
Okay.
Um, so I'm a big fan of Marvel movies and the multiverse. So let's say there's a multiverse scenario where Abraham does it differently and he does the right thing. So can you speculate what he should have done according to the flow of Genesis? How could it have been different to lead
Yeah.
to a different path for Abraham?
So in Genesis 18, a few chapters earlier, he protests the possible destruction of Sodom because Lot and his family, Lot is his nephew, they're living there.
Yeah,
Um, and one of the phrases he uses is, "Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right?" Telling God he should holding God to his standards of righteousness. And I wonder if he could have said something there again in Genesis 22. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and sacrifice him. God, you can't do that. You're the judge of the whole earth. You're the righteous God. You can't ask me to do this because you wouldn't do this. And plus, um, this doesn't show love for my son. Because I think whom you love is meant to ask Abraham to show some love for his son.
yeah,
And I think Abraham can both show love for his son and trust God by interceding and saying, God, please don't make me do this. And I believe the answer would have been God said, okay, I won't. Just as he accepted every prayer of Abraham in chapter
yeah,
18, he would have accepted that. Abraham said, really? I don't need to do that? No, because I'm not a God who requires you to sacrifice your children to show devotion to me. I'm a
right,
God of compassion and love. And then one of the differences in the consequences would be, I think, Abraham's descendants would not be so screwed up. Go read the story of Isaac and Rebekah,
right,
Esau,
right.
Jacob, and Joseph. It is a messed up family. Because one of the points that God wanted to teach Abraham in chapter 18 through this intercessory prayer was that he would learn the way of the Lord, which is righteousness and justice, that he might teach his children and household after him. So if he was able to teach them, would Jacob in his covenant with Laban later call God the fear of my father Isaac? No,
Yeah,
because it would not have been the primary description of God. Perhaps the compassionate one of Isaac would have been the term. And
interesting.
then you would have had, the book of Genesis is structured around the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there is an Abraham story, a Jacob story, and a Joseph story. There is no Isaac story because he's the diminished character.
Hmm.
Because I think the effect of this episode really affected him. So could it be that the book of Genesis would have a story beginning, now these are the generations of Abraham, and have a story of Isaac and
Yeah.
his wholeness? That would have been phenomenal.
Well, that I hope that's whetting people's appetite for this book because he does a lot of the detailed textual work in his book. So if you're an Old Testament studies fan, you'll have plenty of material to keep you busy in his book. If you're interested in prayer and biblical theology, also a lot there. just one thing you just said reminded me that one thing your book offers is to break us of our dualism, where we might choose the things of God and reject the things of mortals. But I think what you're saying is it doesn't always have to come down to that. It doesn't always have to come down to I'm a Christian, so I don't have to care about people because I care about God. We want to create this either or. And I
Yes.
love the beauty of what you're saying. There might be a both and that can be really beautiful. So,
On
um,
that point, there's a
yeah,
cartoon on the internet of Abraham standing above Isaac with a knife, looking up, saying, "Do I have to choose between religion and family?"
yeah,
Yeah, it's the same
that's
point
great.
there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question, which may be the most academic question of all. What are you working on next?
I'm working on a book on 1 Samuel 1 through 15 for Erdmans, but they don't want me to call it a commentary. It's more a series of episodes on the struggle between Samuel and Saul for power. So it's
Wow,
really the dynamics of God, Samuel, and Saul, but beginning with the model of Hannah at the beginning of the book. And it's called Portrait of a Disgruntled Prophet.
nice,
And the subtitle is Samuel's Resistance to God and the Undoing of Saul.
nice.
So I do not have a positive read of Samuel and negative read of Saul. It's complex. They're both
Yeah,
complex characters.
good. Well, we look forward to that. Thank you, Richard, for your great scholarship. I know that that new book is going to also be deeply theological. I can already tell. And so it's not just kind of a reference work, but something that will inspire people's relationship with God as well. Just to anyone watching and listening out there, Richard, when does the Abraham Silence officially hit shelves?
They used to say it was coming on November 16th, but I'm told it can ship from November 1st.
November 1st. Okay, so your
It's
prayers
the
have come
very
true.
earliest. It's the very
That
earliest
the
it
book
comes
is
to.
coming out sooner than expected. My birthday's November 3rd, so I'm
All
I'm
right.
gonna get my copy right around my birthday. I hope. I think this would be a really interesting book for a church group to study. If you professors out there want to have something for your biblical theology class or class on Genesis or prayer or Job, lots of stuff there. Richard, I know you're open to other interviews and things on other places because I know that you have a lot of great things to say about this. So feel free to contact him as well. And I'm a warm enough colleague to say check out Northeastern Seminary of Roberts Wesleyan College. I myself am Wesleyan Holiness. I highly support it. I put my stamp of approval on going to
Amen.
study with Richard and his wonderful colleagues. I worked there. I know the environment. It's a wonderfully rich, enriching, warm community. You learn from great scholars, but more importantly, you'll be formed for ministry as well. So check out the book, and Richard, we look forward to future work from you.
Thank you so much, Nijay. Pleasure talking to you.